Watching Your World at 10 now. Last night, the U.S. Senate Banking Committee Chairman Chris Dodd unveiled a sweeping financial regulation plan, the biggest regulatory overhaul since the Great Depression ended in the 1930s. Let's first hear what Dodd had to say to CNBC in an interview earlier today.
We're doing things that need to be done. We need to stop the too big to fail, the implicit guarantee. We need to deal with consumer protection. We need to deal with having a systemic risk radar that you can start to identify problems early on. I don't want to bore you by going through 11 titles of the bill. We need to get this right. So again, when the next crisis happens, and it will, we have the tools necessary to make sure you don't have the kind of economic wreckage around the landscape that we're seeing today.
So does this bill do enough to prevent a repeat of the 2008 meltdown? Well, joining us to discuss that, Michael Oxley, co-author of the landmark 2002 Sarbanes-Oxley Act and former chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. Mr. Oxley, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We stand on the anvil of a very important regulatory change. One would have never thought that there could have been something more important than the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, but this one will shape the environment of financial services in America for many, many more years to come. What do you make of what Chris Dodd has proposed in his bill?
Well, first of all, I have a great deal of respect for Chris Dodd. I worked with him when I was chairman of the Financial Services Committee on the House side, and when he was chairman of the Banking Committee. And he's an excellent legislator, and I think he wants to do the right thing here. He's also right in pointing out that our structure of regulation in the United States is woefully inadequate. After all, it was written basically during the Great Depression in the 1930s. That was a long time ago. A lot of things have changed, and it's important that we provide a framework for regulation that fits the 21st century model. And so that, I think, is what the approach that he's taking. Keep in mind, of course, that the House has already passed their version of the legislation. So this is the second bite at the apple with the Senate, and of course it still has to pass the committee and the full Senate, as well as a conference committee before it goes to the president. So this is a part of that process. But I think that overall, Chairman Dodd has reached a good conclusion here, dealing with issues that are of paramount importance.
Do you think that this proposed bill arms American government with sufficient number of tools and structures to be able to better regulate the system, be more alert to advance warnings? For instance, you pointed out the issue of over-the-counter derivatives. Now, this bill, from what I've read of it, seems to suggest that the SEC should have, the ability to regulate over-the-counter derivatives. Do you think there are enough moves made in this bill that will help plug the many gaps that emerged in the financial crisis of the last 2 years?
I think it's a great beginning. I really do. I think that the concept of transparency and a regulatory structure is something that we clearly need in the over-the-counter derivatives market. I mean, it was really the Wild West under those old rules, which really were no rules. And so to have the SEC and the CFTC work together in joint rulemaking is critically important to determine how we best regulate and provide more transparency. It seems to me that transparency is absolutely critical here. That is, virtually all of these trades and all of these products should be made available to the regulators almost instantaneously, so that they can. We have now the technology to be able to track those kinds of things, and that would also help in terms of risk assessment and dealing with the overriding systemic risk issue. So I think it's a good start. The committee obviously will take some amendments and deal with it. That's how the legislative process works. But right now I'm reasonably pleased with the direction that the committee is going to take.
Mr. Oxley, there are about 11 different aspects to this bill, or 11 different aspects that this bill tries to cover. We may not be able to discuss all of them in detail. We've spoken of the SEC supervision of over-the-counter derivatives. What otherwise do you think are some of the highlights of this bill that you think are most effective in being able to deal with the many lapses or gaps, or areas of regulatory negligence that have emerged in the last 2 years? For instance, what do you think of the Consumer Protection Agency that this bill proposes? Do you think that that can independently play a strong role in being able to create a level playing field for consumers, as well as ensure that there is some sort of banking oversight?
Well, I think that the House bill perhaps was too strong, and it set up an independent standalone agency for consumer protection. I think the Senate version, I think, makes more sense to have it housed within the Fed. There was arguments between being put it into the Treasury or the Fed. I don't think that location is as important as how it is structured. I don't think we want a consumer protection agency just to run rampant through the banking system. We obviously have a federal system in the United States where states are also play a role in consumer protection. But it's also true that the Fed simply didn't do their job in terms of consumer protection, powers that they had but chose not to use. This bill moves that in a better direction in terms of more ability of the regulators to get a handle on things early, and particularly to deal with the consumer at the initiation of a mortgage or a loan or a credit card, and to provide some understandable consumer protections. For example, part of the problem that dealt with the mortgage market was that people were getting mortgages that had no business owning a house. They didn't have the income, they didn't have a job in many cases, so there was a lot of abuse in that initiation stage of these mortgages, which were ultimately then, of course, securitized and sold in the markets. There's a lot of issues here. The role of the credit rating agencies. During the Sarbanes-Oxley, we dealt with, or we started to deal with the problem of what happens when the customer essentially is paying the credit rating agencies for these ratings. And we saw what happened with a lot of AAA ratings on these products that were simply not AAA by any means. So a lot of these issues specifically need to be dealt with through the Consumer Protection Agency within the Fed, and there will be a lot of debate about how independent they should be, what their powers should be, what role that the state should play in this kind of issue. And I suspect that will be one of the most controversial parts of the legislation as the process moves ahead.
Do you suspect that there could be, because this bill also proposes the setting up of a Financial Stability Oversight Council that will work towards creating an advance warning or alert system, will also work towards creating a better process to break up, too big to fail institutions. But do you think that there could be, by the creation of a Consumer Protection Agency, the Financial Stability and Oversight body, then you've got the Fed, you've got the FDIC, could there be a case of considerable overlap amongst these many regulators, or do you think that the bill lays out very clearly the roles for each one of them to play and the responsibilities and hence their lines of accountability?
I think it's too early to say. I think that as a legitimate question, there are a lot of ifs out there. For example, whether the federal government should preempt the state's authority in this area. That will be hotly contested and debated for quite some time as the process moves forward. I don't have a specific answer, only to say that it appears that we are at least moving towards a modern system of regulation and regulatory structure compared to the early 20th century model that we operate under today.
What do you see missing in this bill? What do you think this bill doesn't quite get right, or has not been able to, approach in the right, most constructive fashion, or could have ended up over-regulating in some fashion? What do you think is wrong about this bill, or items in this bill that you don't like?
Well, first of all, it is such a complex issue and Senator Dodd just introduced it, so there's a general sense, I think, out there that we don't want to go too far in the regulatory structure. After all, you take a very vibrant market like over-the-counter derivatives, which were designed really to spread risk, which, because of their misuse and abuse, ended up concentrating risk and, of course, brought about the collapse of age-old companies. and banks. And so I think you have to be very careful about how you deal with these kinds of issues. I think that one of the things that I would like to see perhaps more of is the legislation giving some relatively broad authority to the regulators. After all, the regulators are the experts in this field. And the regulators work better when you have a totally transparent system.
I have only a minute to go, so I'm going to put one last question to you. Do you think this bill delivers on that requirement or promise of transparency and the political process of putting in place this whole new big regulatory structure? How long do you think it's going to take? Because we also have the Volcker plan that's likely to be given effect through this bill. How long is it going to take for us to see a new regulatory architecture in the U.S.?
Well, I think that I would expect that the bill will pass in some form, and it would probably be sometime probably late this summer, maybe as early as this, or maybe as late as this autumn. But again, as you know, we have an election year going on. I think that's why Chairman Dodd felt it was necessary to move as quickly as possible, because the legislative calendar is somewhat truncated for the rest of this year. And I felt that he feels that if he's going to get a bill, and of course he's retiring at the end of this Congress, that now is the time to move. And I can't really argue with the timing of that. But once the bill is passed and signed by the President, obviously there's going to be a lot of changes have to be made in the regulatory structure and in the markets. And that will obviously take a while. So, but the main thing is right now to get a bill to the President, get it signed, and start the process working, and send a signal to the rest of the world that that we have learned from our mistakes and we're ready to move forward with some positive results.
And you think this is the right bill for the U.S. government to be able to turn into law?
Well, I think this is a good beginning. Obviously, the legislative process will be long and difficult. There will be amendments. There will be arguments. But that's how the legislative process worked. It's all out in the open. It's transparent. Everybody has an opportunity to have their say. Obviously, if I had written the bill, it would be different than what Senator Dodd wrote. But I'm not chairman of the committee anymore. So I think that I think it would be a disaster of immense proportions if the Congress were to adjourn at the end of this year without passing legislation. It would tell the rest of the world that the United States has not learned from its mistakes, and that you're all on your own, and that we don't have the courage or the political will to try to step up and solve problems. That's how important this next few months will be.
Mr. Oxley, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you being on the show. It was great to have you on, and thank you for the insight into Chairman Dodd's bill. That was Michael Oxley speaking to us about the new architecture of financial regulation that's about to be put in place in the United States of America over the course of the next 6 months. We need to take a quick break on Your World at 10.